I'm Wyatt Martin, and this is a special bonus episode of First Look. I hope you're having a great summer, and this is a unique thing. This isn't a normal episode where we have a guest and talk about a topic, but I had a really cool opportunity a couple months ago to join our class at Alderwood called Women Teaching Women, which is a group of ladies who are learning how to preach, learning how to teach from Bible passages, and at the end of this class, they invited me to come and answer some of their questions about how to teach a passage, how to prepare a message, how to deliver it, what's important, what matters. And we just had a great time talking about some of these issues around preaching. And my dear friend and partner in ministry, Lisa Pence, was the host who asked me some of these questions. And if you have ever been interested in peering behind the curtain about how people prepare sermons and messages and teachings, or if there's something that you're interested in yourself, I hope that you find this interesting and beneficial. And it is one of my favorite things to talk about. So I'm excited for you to get to hear it. Let's listen.
Well, welcome to our final Women Teaching Women session. And we get to have a little Q in our time with our very first man at Women Teaching Women. Welcome, Wyatt.
Yeah, thank you.
So what we'll do tonight is you've submitted some amazing questions, and so we've kind of clustered them in sort of like categories, and we're going to just work through those. But I'd invite you to take notes if you think of a question, because questions beget more questions. Feel free to jot them down. If we have time at the end, we'll open it up to some live questions. If we don't have time, I know Wyatt would love to hear from you. Feel free to email him your question if we don't get to your particular question. So,
For sure.
let's go ahead and dive in.
Okay, great.
Yeah. All right. So our first question is, do you see a reason and or opportunity for men and women to be raised up to teach at Alderwood? Does the rise of digital teaching platforms through podcasts, video messages, and video Bible studies series eliminate the need for local teachers within our church?
A little bit of softball. I do think there's a great reason to do this. I'm so glad that you guys are doing Women Teaching Women, and but I totally get it. I mean, we have there's so many avenues for teaching right now. There's so many, right now media, there's a new Bible study streaming thing happening every day, and pastors have podcasts left and right. I mean, we're doing it here at Alderwood and all kinds of stuff. So I think it can kind of feel like maybe we've outsourced teaching to just the very best teachers in the world, and so why bother? But I don't think that way at all. I think the first thing I'd say is that teaching is a gift of the Spirit, that the Holy Spirit empowers and gives believers the gift of teaching to bless His church, to bless other believers, and it is a great thing to develop that gift, to use it to build up the church. And so, I mean, just that in itself is a win. But the other thing I'd say is that teaching is so much more than just maybe the classic thing that you would think in your mind of like the Sunday morning gathering where there's a few hundred people in the audience and there's one person on stage and that person talks for 25 minutes or 30 minutes. I believe in that. I do that a few times a month. But one of the funny things is like, as we've done some research and people have, thought about what's the best way to effectively teach with people. One of the things we've learned is that model of one person talking to 100 people and no feedback is actually not a super effective way of people learning. And you probably experienced that too. I mean, it's easy to lose track of what the person's saying, to kind of get bored or start daydreaming or whatever. And the things that help people learn are things that often can only be done in smaller rooms, in smaller contexts. It's, having two-way communication, letting people ask questions. It's having people talk to each other, having people teach others what they're learning. And so, I think some of the best learning and teaching that happens are things that happen in small environments. And I think this is a great example of it, this class, right? I mean, my guess is that you guys learned way more from having to teach yourself in this class than you ever could, even if an amazing, incredible teacher recorded their best stuff on video and you were in your living room alone watching it. My guess is that this experience in this class of having to put it into practice and give each other feedback and all that was much more valuable than any of that ever could have been. And I think that applies all over the place. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things that I love doing in smaller environments that I just can't do when we're on Sunday morning. I love having people that I'm teaching to have conversations about what we're learning, contribute to the content. I love bringing a whiteboard out, and I do that sometimes on Sunday morning in the auditorium, but you can do it much more effectively in a smaller room. So I think there's all kinds of opportunities for teaching gifts to be used. I think it's great to develop that, and my hope is for you ladies and anybody else listening that if God has given them the gift of teaching, that there'd be all kinds of opportunities for them to use that to bless people at Alderwood and elsewhere with it. So
That's great.
yeah.
And we've kind of brainstormed some ideas of what next steps might be, and it might be sitting around a kitchen table with a cup of coffee and doing interaction that way. It might be a small group, mix of live teaching and small group interaction. So that's really encouraging to hear.
Maybe one-on-one.
One-on-one. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it might just be a
totally.
discipleship. It might be somebody who's new in the faith or has a question about some theological aspect or a book of the Bible, and you're in a spot to be able to teach, and that is teaching. I mean,
Yep.
it doesn't have to be a big group for it to be teaching. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's super encouraging. Okay, so we learned that before we proclaim the message of the Bible to others, we should live with that message ourselves. How does that principle play out for you and for us as teachers?
I think it's huge. I think in some ways for me, it's the difference between authentically teaching and kind of putting on a show from the stage. Because, I mean, the truth is, if you have the gift of teaching, if you're skilled in it, if you have biblical knowledge and you're a gifted communicator, you can probably put together a decent talk. Whether it means anything to you or not. I mean, whether God's actually using it in your life, whether you've actually spent time with the Lord alone and really done the hard work in your heart, you can probably put something together that will pass kind of the smell test for most people listening. But it never will have the power of the Spirit in it unless it's real. And so, I'll be honest with you. I think it's one of the easiest things to lose, especially when your life is busy. For me, if I've got 3 back-to-back Sundays where I'm teaching and a bunch of other things going on and family things happening and all kinds of stuff, I think it's easy to just get into business mode of I know how to do this. I know the steps. I know and I can do it. But it really is it loses the power of it if God's not in it. And even if you are a gifted communicator, I really do think people can tell. I mean, I think people know if you're speaking from your own experience with God or not. And I find that the most powerful things that get said in a message are when somebody is being honest about what the Lord has done in their life through the text that they're talking about. And so I think it is maybe like the thing that matters the most in preparing to talk is sitting with God. And the thing that makes it tough, and we'll get to this a little bit in some of the kind of steps of how to do this, but sitting with the text and letting God work on your heart is something that you can't really just schedule in. Like from 9 to 10 on Tuesday, God is going to speak to me. And so for me, what that means practically is that I really need to, one, in an ideal world, know the text I'm talking on weeks ahead of time, be able to read it, meditate on it, have it in my own quiet time in the morning where I'm not writing my message. It's not work time or any of that. It's just I'm going to read this passage. I'm going to pray. I'm going to ask God to use it in my life. And so for a couple weeks before I'm teaching on something, I'll just have a notes document on my phone that's just kind of a running document. And as I'm reading a text, meditating on it, as I'm praying, as God brings something to mind, I just have my phone out to be able to just jot it down, to be able to say, oh, man, God really brought this person, this situation, this thing to mind. And the reason is not so that I can start writing my message with that, but just so that I can kind of get it out, record it, and not have to remember it for later, but have that be something that when I actually do sit down to start writing my message, I can go back and go, oh yeah, God really did. He pointed this out to me. This was important. This was something that I really had to think about, work on, do, whatever. And that, I think, has the potential to be some of the things that end up being really powerful moments in messages where people kind of get what it means to put a text into practice or to actually apply it, So, yeah.
That's really helpful, isn't it? That it's not a here's the academic piece of it and here's the personal piece of it. That God starts to work in our hearts as we prepare. That's helpful. Yeah. Resources. If you were to choose some of your top resources, Bible being number one, of course.
Yep.
But after that, what would you say are your favorite things as you prepare?
Well, so obviously, I mean, we have commentary, study Bibles. That's a really big piece of how I prepare, and I think that's one of the just kind of litmus tests for me, at least, of do I understand this passage? You know, if I read it, if I sit with it and think I get what's going on, if I go to my NIV Zondervan Study Bible, or I go to some of the commentary sets that I use, and I use the New American Commentary set most often, and they're just in another universe from me, you know, that's at least a red flag to go, okay, I maybe need to kind of circle back here. That usually doesn't happen. I mean, the truth, I think, most of the time, the meaning of a text is fairly clear. There's hard aspects, there's questions, there are texts that are just very difficult to understand, but that's not the common experience. I think usually, if you sit down with the Bible yourself, spend time reading it, spend time looking at the context, spend time meditating on it, you're probably going to grasp the main thrust of the passage. But commentaries are super helpful for that. But then I really do. I love just listening to other Bible teachers. I love listening to podcasts from pastors. I love, going to other churches that I respect and, seeing how they communicated the truth of this to their people. And I find often that I learn not necessarily a totally new thing about the text sometimes, but often it's just a way of applying it to our life that I totally believe in, that is rock solid, and I just wouldn't have put together myself, and that can be a really helpful thing for, especially, reaching a broad audience. If I'm on Sunday morning at Alderwood, I'm teaching to all kinds of people, young and old, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, all that. And so, often it's other churches who have maybe a unique group that they see as their church, that they're just thinking in a different way, and it really helps me to kind of see how this text applies to different kinds of people. But then finally, I just say the biggest resource that we have every week at Alderwood, I'm so grateful for, is just having conversations with other believers about a passage. I mean, we have a teaching team on Tuesday every week. We sit down with whoever's teaching that week on Sunday. They kind of give the idea of where they're going, and we have a chance to give them feedback and say, have you thought about this? Hey, you said this, and I don't get it. That didn't make sense to me. What on earth are you thinking? Sometimes we say that, but not often. But I really do think that, teaching is a gift of the Spirit for the church. God also gives us the church to help us teach and to help us get, the Bible is a book given to the church, not to you personally. So I think that inviting other people into your message, into your prep, is super helpful. And I'm blessed by that every time I get to teach. So
so we're kind of newbies at this. Do you ever find if you maybe listen to other sermons too early in the process, you have it now you have their outline in your head you can't get out?
Yeah, don't do that.
Okay,
yeah. And I don't read commentaries either. And when I sit down with a text for the first time, I don't even use a study Bible.
Okay.
I sit down with a text that is just the text, and for me, like the first thing is trying to figure out what is the main idea of this passage. What is the one thing that if I teach this passage, I want somebody to walk away with being convicted of this, convinced of how it changes their life. And then you go to the commentaries, you go to the other sermons, and you say, okay, am I in the ballpark here? Like, am I crazy, or did I get it? But what happens is, I mean, most passages that you're going to teach on, you could spend your whole life reading the resources that other people have put out on that passage, and you're not going to. But if you start just kind of in the deep end of that, it will scramble your brain. I mean, you just can't ever put the cookies back in the jar. I mean, and so I really try hard to be convinced in my own mind of what I think the main point is before I go to anything else. And then we'll get to some of this other stuff too, but that helps so much to filter, to like read a commentary and go, that's super interesting, but not relevant to my message. And I'm not going to put it in there, and I'm not going to spend any more time thinking about it. That guy's brilliant. I don't need what he said there, though. And then it also helps a ton in the cutting process at the end, which I know we'll cover more later, but when you are convinced of your big idea, it helps you to say, is this thing necessary to communicate my big idea or not? And even if I love it, and even if it's great, if it's not necessary, it can go if it has to. So
That's great.
yeah.
That's super helpful. So how long do you say it takes you to prepare a sermon?
Right now, it takes me somewhere between 10 and 15 hours to prepare the typical sermon or message that I'm given on Sunday mornings. It does vary. Some passages, it just feels like it just comes to you, like it's easy. And the big idea is obvious, and God just really gives you the way to communicate it and the stories and the illustrations and all that. And then sometimes it isn't that way at all, and it's laborious. And we've been in a couple of passages that I've taught in Romans in this series that we've been in recently that have felt that way, where it's probably been closer to 20 to 25 hours. But maybe it'll be helpful if I just kind of give the standard.
Let's do
kind of. So, in general, for me, we know our passages way out ahead of time. There's a long schedule of passages and who's assigned to what, and it normally doesn't change. And so, a few weeks ahead of time, I'm trying to spend an hour in a passage to just get the big idea. That's my only goal. My only goal is to say, what is the big idea of this passage? And then that's, with my big idea in mind, I'm able to keep reading that passage over and over, think about it, meditate on it, pray about it, not writing anything, not making an outline, anything like that. Just sit with the passage for a week or two. Then the week of, right now, we're recording our sermons at 11 a.m. on Thursday, which is it's a different thing, but I love it because it means it's done by 12 a.m. or by 12 p.m. on Thursday, and I can have a weekend. So that's the deadline, is 11 a.m. on Thursday. Monday, I spend about 4 hours, and that work is a lot of study, of reading commentaries, of reading study Bibles, of really trying to make sure that I grasp the entirety of the passage. And then the goal on Monday for me in that 4 hour block, about 4 hour block, is to have an outline, to have my big idea is this, here are my points, and also to at least have taken my first crack at, here are some illustrations. Here are some stories that I think this is going to help people understand these things. Here are some ways of making this concrete for people. And that's Monday for me. Tuesday, another 4 hours. And on Tuesday, I'm actually writing content. I'm trying to develop a manuscript, more or less, on Tuesday. Wednesday is a huge meeting day for us here at the church, and I really can't count on getting any time on Wednesday. So I will try, I'll try to read through what I have, read the passage at least, so I'm not totally not engaging in it at all on Wednesday. But then Thursday, and I'm a procrastinator, I have been my entire life. Thursday, I have to preach at 11. I wake up at 5 and go out to my couch. My kids are still asleep, and Caitlin's still asleep, and that's where we're doing the fine-tuning. I'm cutting, I'm rehearsing, but not to memorize, just to become comfortable with the content. And then the other thing for me, that Thursday morning before I teach, is dialing in the time. So at this point, I don't deliver my messages anymore before I teach them. But I do now have enough history to know what word count in Word associates to a time in delivery, and it's usually right.
Yeah.
Last Sunday, we got done recording the online one, and I was like 5 minutes early, and I had no idea why, and I still don't. So it's not always perfect, but it's pretty close. And so done with that by 10 a.m., drive to the church and deliver, and that's it. So, that's 12 hours-ish, and it's not perfect. It varies. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. Depends on how focused I am and how much I get distracted by people walking in my office or my phone going off or whatever,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's helpful. Thanks. Yeah. And you just kind of spoke to when you start thinking about illustrations to put in stuff. So speak to that a little more. What is the purpose of illustrations and stories as you think about them? How do you make decisions about what to include, how many to include, and any principles you can share with us
Yeah.
about placement of illustrations, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I know you guys talked a little bit about the ladder of abstraction, which is my favorite thing. And so that's one of the answers to why for illustrations is this concept of the ladder of abstraction, that ideas range from high, which is totally abstract, things like freedom, love, goodness. You can't picture them, you can't hold them in your hand, but they're important, to low on the ladder, totally tangible, completely able to picture them in your mind, but often less important. This microphone, my iPad, those kinds of things. Totally concrete, not that important. And one of the reasons for including illustrations in your message is just simply that human beings are not capable of dealing in the abstract in an unending sense. Your brain cannot do it. And so as a teacher, what you teach only matters if somebody's hearing it and understanding it. If you say the most brilliant thing in the world, but there's nobody there to hear it, you're not teaching. You're talking to yourself. So you can't just think about what do I want to say. You have to think about how are people actually going to be able to hear this and put it into practice. And so that is one of the reasons. What good illustrations do is they deal in the realm of the concrete for a moment, and that actually gives people's brains the time to take a deep breath and catch up and be ready to engage in abstract again. Everybody's tolerance is a little bit different, but everybody, if you only speak in the abstract, eventually will stop listening. They just will. They will stop paying attention. They can't do it. And so you have to give them the ability to process what you're talking about. And doing concrete illustrations is one of the ways that you can do that. So I think that's one of the purposes. But the other thing is, I think illustrations and stories help people actually apply the principles that you're teaching in the text. It's important to have good theology. It's important to understand God, to understand who we are. But if you can never make the leap to actually putting that into practice in your life, then it really isn't doing what we want to be doing with teaching the Bible. And so I think, at least for me as a listener of teaching, one of the things that's most helpful is watching somebody put into practice what they're talking about. And even if it's a different application for me, it just helps me to relate. It helps me to kind of put my life into the situation that they're describing. And so I think good illustrations can do that. As far as what to include, like how, in the whole world of things that you could use to illustrate your text, what works, I am a huge fan. I'll just say this. One of the things I hate about talking about teaching is that now you guys are all going to take what I'm saying and apply it to me when you hear me. So I'm not perfect at this, but one of the things that I think is just so good is to use things from your own life. One of the things when I talk to people about teaching is a mediocre personal story beats an excellent story that you heard somewhere else every time. And so don't think like you have to have the most insightful, witty story with the perfect ending from your own life, and you're on the airplane, the person gives their life to the Lord, whatever. Like you don't have to have the most amazing story if you just do an honest job of thinking about your own life and saying, this is where I see this happening. I mean, this when Jesus teaches about money and how you can't love God and money, this is one time in my life where I realized I really was letting my heart be given to possessions and money. It doesn't have to be an amazing story. Just be honest. And people they're just so much more drawn to you being honest about your life than they are about the amazing thing that Spurgeon said about whatever. They just and you can say that too. But your personal stuff is just so much more important. Two other things about what to include. Make sure that where you're putting an illustration is that it's actually illustrating the important aspect of your text, the big idea in some sense, or one of the points. Sometimes I'll hear people teach and they illustrate something. It's a decent illustration, it's a good story, it fits, but it's like illustrating some obscure part of their text that doesn't even really matter to their message, and that's not a total loss, but it's not as helpful as something could be if you're really helping to understand the main idea, the thrust of your text. And then make sure it's really concrete. That's one of the biggest misses, I think, is that it's easy to think that just the very fact that something is an illustration makes it low on the ladder of abstraction, makes it concrete, and that's actually not true. If I'm talking about marriage or conflict or something like that, and my illustration is, I'm married, and Caitlin and I, sometimes we have conflict in our marriage, and that's really hard, but because I trust Jesus, we're okay. That, I guess, is a personal story, but it wasn't concrete at all. I mean, I didn't give you anything to actually hang on to in that, or picture in your mind, or put yourself there. But if I say that exact same story or illustration, I say, last week I opened the front door to my house, and I walked in, and Caitlin, it was so obvious she had had a hard day. Our kids' toys were everywhere in the living room. There was a fire truck on its side, over on the side of the wall. My son Thatcher was running through the hallway screaming. He was naked except for his diaper. Hazel had a piece of gum stuck in her hair, and Caitlin looked at me and said, "I need your help." And I said to her, "I've had a tough day. I got to go to the room and just chill out." Like, suddenly you're there with me, right? I mean, that is a concrete illustration. You can picture it in your head. So those are two ways of illustrating the same thing with the same story, but one of them actually is the concrete thing and one of them's not. And so when you're going to tell an illustration, make sure that you actually take advantage of it, that you actually make it a concrete thing and not just another abstraction. And then where to place it, I mean, there's no, this isn't a law or anything. Just off the top of my head, I think I don't want to go more than about 5 minutes before I've given people something concrete. 5 minutes of abstract thought, you're guaranteed that you're going to start losing the first group of people. Not everybody. Some people hang with you for a lot longer. If Chris Taylor's in the audience, he's going to be with you for the 45 minutes of abstract thought. But you're going to start losing the first people, I think, after 5 minutes. And it doesn't have to be long. It can be a short thing. The example in my mind is just from my message on Sunday. We talked about the ideas of having the first fruits of the Spirit. And I took about 45 seconds to say, I've got a pear tree in my front yard. It has blossoms. There's buds of new fruit. The first fruit, it's not yet here, but it is starting and it is real. It doesn't have to be long. Like, that's just something that short can give people just like a mental break. They're picturing a pear tree. They're not thinking about a theological concept. And so, yeah.
That's really helpful. Yeah, because some of us are storytellers. I love telling a story, and so when I think about an illustration, I'm picturing a full-blown story. And so you're saying that it doesn't always have to be a lengthy illustration. It can be just something that kind of gets our mind, down low on the ladder.
And there's a place for the full story.
Yeah.
I mean, I love it too, and it can be really powerful.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be that to serve the
Yeah.
purpose. It can be short. It can be simple, and that's totally fine too.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
yeah.
Yeah. So, tips for shortening our messages,
Yeah.
because they just grow. They
do.
And we fall in love with them. We've labored over this, however many thousand words now are in our Word document. Yeah.
Cutting is the hardest thing. The hardest part of the whole process is cutting after you've already written it. And I sent Lisa a Teams message today asking, is it okay if I say this? But I'm going to say it anyway. Around the hallways in the offices, the pastors refer to cutting out of our message as killing our babies. Okay, because that's what it is. I mean, you created this thing and you love it, and now it's time to get rid of it. And so it's so hard. But my encouragement to you is that cutting is also one of the most beneficial things you will do to your message. The difference between a decent message and a great message is how much you cut and how well you cut stuff out of it. Anytime you have the opportunity to say one thing clearly and compellingly, or two things that you don't have time to get into, always pick the one thing that you can say clearly and compellingly. When somebody walks out of your message and God used it to really impact them, the chances are it's one thing that you said. It's not everything combined. There is something that God used in what you said to clearly explain his word, and it impacted them. And so having too much material in your message often clouds the thing that you actually really hope people are going to walk away from. And so it's worth it. It's always better to cut before you get on stage than after, to realize you're talking and the time is down to 0 and you're realizing, how am I going to land this plane now? And so as hard as it is, if you can be disciplined and actually make sure that you really do only walk up there with the stuff that you actually have the time to talk about, I mean, that is going to make your messages that much better. Okay, how to do it? I think it all starts before you ever get to the part of cutting. If you are crystal clear in your big idea, that is the thing that helps you cut. If you know, like, this is the point, this is the thing I want people to walk away from, then you have a measure, you have a lens to look at your message and say, okay, what here isn't absolutely necessary to communicate the big idea? What is something that I just think is interesting or fun or cool or whatever, but doesn't actually help me communicate the main idea clearly and compellingly? I think another kind of mental tool that I use is, I'm the time that I'm used to hitting is 30 minutes, and I'll ask the question: if I had 10 minutes to teach this message, what would I say? How would I do this message in 10 minutes? And that just helps me have to do the hard work of prioritizing, of saying, okay, if I had 10 minutes, I would only say this and this and this. And I know that those things can't go. They have to stay. And then that opens up the rest of it to say, okay, what in the rest of that doesn't need to be here? It's hard. I hate it. I hate it every time. But the other thing I'd say is just remember, there's always another message in the future. You can save things for later.
You have to like burn it in the fire, or is there a place that you save cut
material?
material?
Oh yeah, so I have a notes document that is just ideas. It's just sermon illustrations and stories and things that I wanted to say and haven't, and they all live there for later. I don't know when, but I'll come back to them at some point. And I just sometimes I look at people on stage, and it just seems like they think that this is their farewell address. Like they're never going to speak again. Everything they want to say, they have to say now, and that's just not true. And even if it is, trust that God's going to use His text and the main point of it to do the work that the Spirit's going to do. You don't have to cram it full. It has become easier for me because of the number of times that I've done the hard job. I've taken the things out that I didn't want to, and it has been those messages that have been the most impactful. It's been those things that God has used the most, and I'm convinced of it now that it is just always worth it. And then the other thing is, and I'm rambling now at this point, but you're the only one who feels the pain of it. Oh. Nobody else knows. They don't know that you cut anything out of the message. They just see the final product. And so that's the other thing is, like, think of them. Think of the people who are going to hear it, and you endure the pain so that they don't have to.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So the final question I have on my paper, we've fallen in love with the exegetical process, right? And so one of the questions was, sometimes a topical sermon series may be perceived as not exegetical from a listener's perspective. How do you make sure that these kinds of sermons don't just feel like a college lecture, or that they don't just feel simply like, let me tell you how you need to change, or
Sure.
What are you doing wrong, that kind of thing?
Topical versus exegetical. For some people, that's become like a litmus test. People are looking for a new church, and they say, "Well, be sure you find a place that doesn't teach topically," it'll be how you judge a teacher. Do they teach topically or not? And I really feel like people have just missed the point of this conversation. I feel like for some people, they think an exegetical sermon is one where you explain what the Bible says. And a topical sermon is one where you just stand up and share your thoughts on a topic. And that's just not true. I mean, that a bad topical sermon is one where you stand up and share your thoughts on a topic. But if you're preaching God's word, if you're actually faithfully communicating the text of a passage, whether you're teaching exegetically or topically, you are explaining what the Bible says. You are explaining a text and what it means. And there are bad exegetical sermons. There are bad topical sermons. A bad exegetical sermon is one that explains the meaning of a text but never actually ties it into your life in any way. I mean, one that actually means anything for how you live and follow Jesus. And that is, it can be completely exegetical, but just not applicable in any way, and that's no good. A bad topical sermon is one that has a lot of things to say about your life and how you should live and think, but never actually talks about what the Bible says or teaches. And so for me, I think about exegetical and topical just being different ways to organize your message. An exegetical sermon is organized around the logic of a text. It's saying, our time here is going to be spent explaining what Ephesians 4, 1-12 says. And so we're going to walk through that. We're going to explain it. And that organizes the text, or organizes the sermon, I should say. But hopefully, as you walk through that text, you are tying it into topical things. I mean, you're talking about what does this mean for us as followers of Jesus. It's just organized by the text. A topical sermon is organized by the topic. We're saying, we're going to talk today about marriage. We're going to talk today about prayer. We're going to talk about, humility, whatever it is. But if you're teaching topically, I hope that you have found a text that addresses your topic. And if we dive into this topic, you're going to say, this passage speaks to this, and so let's see what the Bible has to say about this topic. And you're going to explain the text, and you're going to talk about the topic. And I really think either of those are excellent ways to help people understand what the Bible is saying. For people who have a hard time being okay with topical messages, one of the things that I say, and I don't know if it's ever convinced anybody, but I say it anyways, is just realize that the people listening to your sermon, their lives are topical. They are struggling with topics. They're struggling with things, circumstances, things that have happened in their life. They're wondering what the Bible has to say about their kid who has walked away from the Lord, or the fact that they haven't felt God's presence in their life in years, or the fact that they, don't give and they don't feel like they can be generous with their money. Whatever it is, like the things that are on their heart that are burdening them are topics. And if we can't answer what the Bible has to say to the things that really are going on in people's lives, then I think we're kind of wasting our time a little bit. So I wouldn't be afraid of topical messages. I would just say, when you have the opportunity to speak topically, talk about what the Bible says. Find a passage that speaks to it and explain it and preach it. And if somebody accuses you of being a heretic because you preached a topical message, just say thank you very much and move on. And that's okay.
That's really helpful. Yeah, because we were talking earlier about how we as women will be invited to speak at a tea and say, could you speak to this topic? And so that makes it really easy if you find a passage that kind of unites your thoughts and organizes it that way. So
yeah, and I think a pitfall with that is, here's I think kind of why topical gets a bad rap sometimes. Somebody invites you to speak at a topic, and you sit down and you just think about your answer. So Lisa, you say, would you come speak on prayer? And so you just sit down and go, prayer. Okay. Point 1, prayer is important. Point 2, God wants us to pray. Point 3, prayer changes things. And then you go to Google and you say, let's find some verses for this. I don't know. Point 1's this. I got to find a verse. Google. Let's look through all the different translations to find one that finally. And that is a mistake. That is you doing the process in reverse, right? That is you saying, here's what I think. I'm going to go find a place where the Bible can back me up. I think topical is much harder than exegetical because doing a good job topically means that you have to actually sit with a bunch of passages. You have to read through things and understand passages to figure out what does the Bible actually say about this? Where can I actually sit with a text and know that I'm actually doing a meaningful job of explaining it, not just forcing it to say what I already wanted to say. And there is, you've all heard both of those things probably, but if you do that hard work, if you really do let a text speak for itself and it has to do with the topic that you're speaking, I think that is an excellent way to deliver a message and can be super powerful.
That's great. Yeah. That's super helpful. This was great. We filled up our time. This was awesome.
Yes.
And if you yes, Jeanette, how do you get rid of extra words, so, and distracting body motions, gestures,
The battle is never over. It's like whack-a-mole. You get rid of one and a new one pops up. The only way that I know to deal with it is to watch yourself. So I watch every video of every message that I preach, and I would encourage you to do the same, and you'll hate it. It's super awkward. You won't like it at all, but you will look at yourself and you'll go, get your hands out of your pocket. What do you do? I mean, you will be the biggest critic of yourself if you're watching yourself on video, and you'll remember it the next time you're teaching. And so that's the way that you do it. Yeah. It's not easy. I constantly see myself doing new things, and I don't know how it happened. I don't know where it came from. And then I got pretty good at getting rid of ahs and ums and likes and all that. And then strangely, we started recording a podcast, and all of my work that I have achieved in sermons just went out the door in the podcast. I started saying like and ah and all those things all over again. So, yeah, and people are pretty gracious, honestly. I wouldn't worry a ton about it.
Yeah. Good question, though.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a quick question that's just burning that they'd love to ask? We could do one more quick response question. We good? Wyatt.Martin@amcc.org.
Yeah,
right. Send your questions. He'd love to hear it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for letting me be here.
Yeah. This is great.
Well, there you have it. I hope that was an interesting conversation for you. And I just want to encourage you that if you're a follower of Jesus, God has gifted you in unique ways to bless the church. And maybe that's teaching, maybe it's something else, but God has more for you at Alderwood than just being somebody who attends or somebody who listens or watches other people use their gifts. He has ways for you to pour into others with the way that He created you and gifted you through His Spirit. So find what that is and jump in, and we will be back in the fall in full with a new season of our podcast. And until then, let's keep following Jesus together.